Hey, didn't you hear? We're in the business of selling crazy, and business is real good in these here parts. Good evening once again, everybody. This is Hell's Unicorn, and I believe I promised all of you another video at some point giving my views on the particular topic of fanaticism, particularly as it pertains to politics. You see, too much of late with my videos, I've been a bit too specific with regards to whatever point I was trying to make. I was either doing videos specifically to endorse a specific political candidate or to otherwise endorse some other specific course of action for some very specific temporal matter, so to speak. I'm going to try something a little bit different this evening. I'm going to try to do what a lot of my favorite fellow YouTubers, such as Fringe Elements and Mareku and several others do, which is talk more generally about the concepts involved in politics and, as a consequence, general philosophy. I think that a lot of times people tend to conflate two very different concepts. At least my argument is that these two particular concepts are very much distinct and in no way joined at the hip. The first of these two concepts is what we refer to as a fringe position, or an extreme position, or, as some of us might call it, a consistent position. And this position can manifest itself differently depending on the given issue. Being fringe is sort of a relative concept because it has to do specifically with the relation between a dissenting view and a more commonplace or otherwise a more mainstream viewpoint. The second of these two concepts is fanaticism. Fanaticism, by contrast to a fringe political position, is not a relative term in any sense whatsoever, I would argue. It is rather a very specific and a very objective and universal concept, which will always manifest itself in a very similar way when put into action. No matter what specific political or philosophical issue we're dealing with, the results of fanaticism, I would argue, are often the same. By contrast, being fringe, being way out in left field on a particular political issue, does not necessarily denote fanaticism. It can, but I would argue not necessarily. In fact, I would argue that fringe politics, in certain instances, is the only way to avoid fanaticism. Now, in order to qualify these two very different definitions, I want to bring out a few examples. Some of these examples are going to be a bit more archaic, but most of them are going to be more present day because I don't really feel like giving a history lesson here, although undoubtedly that's going to happen to some extent. And I'm going to start more with the historical aspects here, and this is all going to pertain specifically to American history. I'm not going to get into the history of religious politics in Europe during the medieval and Renaissance period and all of that stuff before then, because that's an entirely different bag of cats than what we're dealing with right now here in the United States and also in the rest of the world at present. During the American Revolution, there were several different modes of thought going on simultaneously in this country, but they were all pretty much united during the conflict itself against the outside aggressor. Once peace came into the equation, things changed a little bit and people were free to express themselves a bit more openly, and these differences became more manifest. I would argue that just about everybody in Congress at the founding of this country, in one respect or another, was fringe. We had people that held fringe rationalistic views, particularly in the case of Thomas Paine and Ethan Allen, and to a somewhat lesser extent Thomas Jefferson, and these people were probably the most directly influenced by John Locke. As it would come to everybody's attention, even amongst the more moderate theological types such as John Adams, there was a heavy tendency towards this mode of rationalism, and in present-day libertarian politics, the rationalistic viewpoint with regards not just to religion but also to social contract theory and all of this other stuff, you tend to get more of a rationalistic tilt, specifically as it goes with modern libertarianism. There are dissenters, naturally, when it comes to social contract theory within the rationalistic camp, but for all intents and purposes, they're pretty much unified in the sense that they have a more skeptical view of religion and, as a consequence, even of politics in the realm of governance. So, this is, by logical conclusion, a fringe position. Likewise, there was another position. It was more heavily rooted in the Calvinistic, Reformed Christian side of the coin, so to speak, with regards to the Founding Fathers, manifest probably most directly through specifically Patrick Henry, to an extent Samuel Adams, but he was less of a player after the Revolution had been fully underway, and then others like John Jay. I mean, there was a good helping of people that were of a more religiously conservative mindset. These viewpoints, I would argue, equally fringe, came into conflict with each other at certain points, and thus it was necessary to observe a more polycentric mode of government specifically so that we could avoid fighting another war amongst ourselves afterwards to determine who was going to be running the whole thing. The whole purpose of running the whole thing was actually an area where the founders of this country made a break with history. Some made the break more extremely than others. I would argue that the Anglican contingent, or at least most of the Anglican contingent of the Founding Fathers, probably stayed the closest to what would be dubbed right-wing politics in the British Isles, so to speak, and maintaining a similar monarchical view of government. And as a result, thanks to them, we got the office of the presidency, which has been the source of many of our present-day woes. However, naturally, there was also other camps that could be viewed as fringe or not so fringe, depending on how you look at it. I would argue that the only specific viewpoint amongst the Founding Fathers which was not fringe was the view exemplified by Alexander Hamilton and his specific contingent of the Federalist movement. They were the ones that ended up having to make the most concessions because they were outnumbered amongst the others that wanted a different mode of governance. Now, again, these different viewpoints were not necessarily fully in harmony with each other, but they were united in the sense that they didn't want a tyrannical, monolithic presence in Washington dictating every single thing to them. They'd had enough of that with the royal family over in Britain. Nevertheless, the presence of these, I'll call them red conservatives for lack of a better term, persisted in this country, and they continued to push old school solutions, or, I guess you could argue some of them were innovative in some respects, specifically the concept of a central bank specifically dealing with fractional debt, which is something that was being tried over in the British Isles and maybe to an extent in certain Rothschild banks that were starting to blossom in France and Germany. But overall, bankers were limited in how much they could degrade currency in the name of pumping up an economy by the monarchs themselves in many cases, because the monarchs were a little bit skeptical of something like this. This looked like voodoo magic to them, and in that respect they probably weren't very far off. So this particular conservative movement was specifically embodied in the notion that we're going to stick with a particular mode of thought that's already established. So we can't really refer to these people as being fringe, at least not relative to the situation that was present at the time. However, I would argue that amongst the various factions of the Founding Fathers, that these conservative-minded people that were part of the Hamilton camp were probably the most fanatical. I say this specifically because in the face of all logic which dictated that you cannot expect a different result when you take the same course of action, they elected to stay with the old way of doing things and simply dreaming of mercantile empire rather than trying something a bit different. At the end of the day, Hamiltonian economics is firmly nestled in the bosom of European mercantilism. He was basically a man seeking after an empire in his own image. He wanted to be king rather than King George. And he was willing to do a number of things in order to gain this particular standpoint, such as make war with French South America and French Florida, and Spanish Florida, excuse me. And there's actually some good film footage from a recent miniseries done on John Adams where him and Hamilton had it out on this particular point. But regardless, Hamilton was in the mindset that a recently born republic with limited resources could stand toe-to-toe with the French Empire, albeit under a similarly disorganized protectorate in Napoleon. It takes a certain kind of madness to be drawn into this mode of thought. But even amongst the status quo, this form of fanaticism is possible. And in the case of Alexander Hamilton, I would argue that the example itself is not particularly compelling because he never really got the opportunity to fully act out what he intended to act out. He was outnumbered by people that wanted nothing to do with this mode of action, even within his own Federalist Party in the case of John Adams. Now, John Adams was no saint when it came to issues of civil liberties and overall political discourse, but he definitely had it right on the issue of avoiding imperialism, especially when you haven't a prayer of actually succeeding at it. Now, let's flash forward a little bit for another example of fanaticism and how it can often manifest itself in establishment politics rather than fringe politics. The lead up to the American Civil War. Now, I wish to qualify my assertions right at the beginning before I get any nonsense in the comments section over this. I am not going to be discussing whether it is right or wrong to utilize slave labor, be it through compulsory hereditary reasons, as was done in the South, or through indentured servitude in order to orient European paupers to life in the colonies. That is not my intent, and I'm not entertaining any debates on that. As far as I'm concerned, that is off topic. What I do wish to draw upon here, and the primary influence for this particular part of this rambling session, is that I've recently completed a book by R.L. Dabney called In Defense of Virginia and Through Her the South, which details the lead-up and the aftermath of the Civil War, and more particularly the politics that was coming about in the wake of all of this. And it's the politics that I wish to focus on more here. It's already been qualified by several apt historians of the Austrian School of Economics, most specifically Thomas de Lorenzo and Thomas Woods Jr., that Abraham Lincoln himself was a staunch and ardent protectionist and a person who was more of the mercantile school of economics. Very heavily influenced by the likes of Alexander Hamilton and of our good European brethren who were also in the business of asserting economic dominance through imperialism rather than through free trade. The abolitionist movement, which basically slingshotted Abraham Lincoln and his mercantile cronies into power, were the picture-perfect representation of fanaticism. And here's why. regardless to whether one believes that slavery is a moral evil or not. It takes a certain type of lunatic in the face of better options and more peaceful options to resort to a course of action that plunges an entire country into civil war and results in tens, yea, hundreds of thousands of deaths. It takes a certain kind of fanatic to turn a blind eye to martial law being implemented in New York City, to journalists being jailed for the crime of dissenting against the almighty opinion of the President of the United States, and to turn a blind eye to the rampant political corruption of the radical Republicans. It takes a certain kind of fanatic, yes indeed, to excuse all of that in the name of righting one simple, singular moral wrong. What type of fanatic indeed does it take to essentially plunge everything into chaos and to invite every other vice imaginable, every other abuse of power imaginable, in order to right one particular wrong that in and of itself is no comparison whatsoever to what was rained down in its place? It takes a certain kind of a fanatic, and this is where I'm going to hit a nerve. It takes a certain kind of fanatic to say we're going to emancipate slaves, but after the emancipation is over, we are going to do absolutely nothing to assimilate these people into society so they have a means to take care of themselves. These are all charges that are not only levied on the North by R.L. Dabney, but that are substantiated with specific references to statistical data that was available at the time via the Congress. Every assertion that R.L. Dabney made in that book was backed up with something concrete. By contrast, all of the pro-abolitionist literature that I have read from that period, and I'll admit I haven't read all of it, but I've read a fair amount of it, is loaded up with unsubstantiated and often slanderous claims upon the character of people living in the South. Not only slaveholders, but the entire population of the state. I read one particular book where the most horrendous crime of all that was perpetuated by the slaveholders of the South was that they were breeding slave labor. He was railing on and on about the fact that 4 million blacks were essentially bred into existence in the South. Basically, the fertility rate of African Americans living in the South was immeasurably larger than they were in the North, where they were subject to similar persecution, only without the institution of slavery. It takes a certain type of fanatic to basically boldface say, in the face of simple reality, that the greatest crime perpetuated by the South was that they allowed so many black people to be born. What a horrible concept, the notion that black people are procreating, they're bringing children into the world. What a horrible concept. And this is coming from the so-called people that were looking to end the evil institution of slavery and free the African from his bondage. If any of you have ever seen the movie Conan the Barbarian, you will note that there is a part after Conan has become so popular a gladiator that his master can no longer stand to keep him around, that he actually sets him free with no means to sustain himself by food. He just simply cuts his chains with a sword and says you're free, and leaves him on his own to defend for himself in the wilderness with no idea of what he's going to do. While Conan was a slave, he was guaranteed 3 square meals. His life was at peril whenever he was in the gladiator arena, but he had structure to his life. and he was essentially thrown out on his own. And the next scene that you see after he's been freed is him being chased down by a pack of wild dogs looking to eat him. A similar comparison could be made to that slaveholder that freed Conan the Barbarian, to the so-called Northern radical Republicans that sought emancipation but didn't think the next couple of steps ahead on how to make life more hospitable for these particular people of African descent who had been freed. When African American activists, racial activists, argued that the North did not fight the war to end slavery, in a sense you could argue that they were correct, because Abraham Lincoln himself had said in many speeches that the institution of slavery was not really high on his priority list. And for the radical Republicans, their fanaticism towards the notion that all people are equal, they were basically proto-egalitarians after the same strain that we deal with today. Those people were more obsessed with the idea of abolishing slavery than they were actually making for a benevolent system in which all of us can actually live and prosper in. That was a little bit too much information for them to process, because they were too busy hating slavery to actually find a better system to replace it with, so to speak. In my opinion, that is the heart and soul of fanaticism, and it is basically comparable only to the fanaticism of continual generations of public educators who tried to etch into my head, into the heads of every other American, the notion that the Southern gentleman and the Southern pauper alike were nothing more than black-hating psychopaths who took joy in hucking slaves off of slave boats and watching them drown. In fact, in the case of Virginia, they didn't even have any ships going out to pick up slaves. All the slaves that they had brought into their state were actually brought in from Massachusetts and sold in Virginia. And Virginia had never at any point actually endorsed the slave trade. They took the slaves off the hands of the particular slave traders that brought them in, and probably doing so saved the lives of these slaves that were in these deplorable conditions. I mean, they were probably filthy because they had no access to clean water to bathe themselves. They were probably starving. I mean, it's inhuman what these people were put through. And giving them a home and 3 square meals, slavery may be an evil institution, but living is better than dying, I would argue. That's the reason why the right to life comes before the right to liberty, although I would argue that life isn't much good without some form of liberty. And indeed, I would argue that liberty itself can lend itself to a form of fanaticism if it isn't perfectly understood. I would argue that even under the tyranny of a monarchical government, that there is a certain amount of liberty that is allotted to the people living in that particular country. It's not sufficient for what I would consider a good model system, so to speak, but there is some liberty to speak of. And indeed, there is a certain liberty that comes with various institutions that could be viewed as forceful and maybe to a certain extent arbitrary, such as the relation of father to son, so to speak, particularly when the son is not of an age of accountability. But anyway, that's kind of getting a bit off topic. Ultimately, in my own desire to be fringe but to avoid fanaticism, I've come to believe that a lot of the stuff that I was taught in history classes was nonsense, and it was basically propaganda without any actual connection to the truth that was simply put out by the victorious party in a struggle that ended long ago. Moving on into the present period. Currently, right now, we have a number of hot-button issues in present-day America that have everybody's attention at present. One of these is a topic that I haven't really spent a whole lot of time on, and that is the so-called Fast and Furious gun runner scandal. This is where my beliefs regarding the fanaticism of both sides, but more particularly the Democratic side, come into play. Now, it takes a certain kind of fanaticism to be upset with Barack Obama's invoking of executive privilege in order to protect people in his regime who have committed unconstitutional acts. Because George W. Bush did the same thing, Bill Clinton did the same thing. Every president going back the past 50, 60 years at least has invoked this privilege and by result has abused it. The fact of the matter is that if something is done and it is wrong, it is simply such. It is not subject to a relative comparison, and it is definitely not diminished by that comparison if another wrong exists in another party. The simple fact that Peter may have robbed Paul does not preclude the wrongness of Paul stealing from John. Let's just put it that way. Evil begets evil, but evil never justifies evil. Case in point, on the left-wing side of things, where the hypocrisy has become utterly ridiculous. Bill Maher and Rachel Maddow are probably the two most dynamic characters in this little passion play that we're observing here. And particularly on Bill Maher's show Real Time, this became evident. In a discussion between these two and two other parties, one of them is one of the head honchos over at Reason Magazine. The other fella, his name escapes me at present, but he was probably more there to represent the conventional right-wing side, and the Reason Magazine guy was there to represent the libertarian side, ergo the non-Republican but still dissenting side of the coin. Bill Maher's answer to the notion that Congress is going to hold Eric Holder, the Attorney General, in contempt for withholding vital documentation from Congress. His opinion basically is that they're doing this for political reasons. In fact, his exact words in response to the notion that 300 Mexicans died because of these guns that were allowed to walk over the border was, Republicans don't care about 300 dead Mexicans. Now, this drew laughter from the audience and thus reveals the abject stupidity by way of fanaticism of Bill Maher's audience. But let's instead focus on Bill Maher himself. His specific response, and it was done in a snarky tone, so I understand the applause from the audience. It's basically a method employed when preaching to the choir. His basic response to the notion that 300 Mexicans are dead is, Republicans don't care about 300 dead Mexicans. But that's only half the statement. The rest of the statement is basically, Republicans don't care about 300 dead Mexicans, so it doesn't matter. So who cares? That's basically the rest of the sentence. To which I simply respond, 300 dead Mexicans may not matter to the Republicans, but they definitely don't matter to you, if that's your response. But remember again what I said regarding fanaticism. Fanaticism, even though it pretends to be the pinnacle of consistency, is actually anything but. They're consistent usually on one narrow and very specific thing. In the case of Bill Maher and this particular thing, he's simply protecting Barack Obama just because. You know, Bill Maher's an asshole and he does what assholes do. He takes the opinion that he thinks is going to piss off the most people. I take very little of what Bill Maher says seriously on any topic, but nonetheless he represents the other side in this particular instance. He's a popular media figure, so he's going under the axe. Rachel Maddow. Moving over to her for a little bit. Rachel Maddow basically asserts that this whole thing is nonsense because some Republicans have floated the idea that there is some sort of conspiracy to cheat people out of their right to own, buy, and sell guns. The simple fact that Rush Limbaugh believes this and certain members of the Fox News media staff believe this does not necessarily mean that Darrell Issa or any of the other people that are basically presiding over these hearings believe that. In fact, Darrell Issa has made no indication whatsoever that he believes this one way or the other. Rachel Maddow, on the other hand, has, by contrast, revealed that she very much believes that regardless to whether or not some people believe that there's a conspiracy going on here, that it's applicable to anybody, whosoever, that questions the logic of this program and ties it specifically to Barack Obama and Eric Holder. There's not really any logic to that assertion, nor to anything that Bill Maher says on any topic. But bear in mind, people watch these particular media figures in spite of obvious dishonesty. And why? Because they're fanatical. They have a certain set of key triggers that are set off whenever they hear what they want to hear or what they don't want to hear. And both of those are predetermined. By consequence, these people cannot be reasoned with, even if you are the star pupil of any school that deals in political rhetoric or in argumentation. You will not sway these people any more than you could sway the Spanish Inquisition. Once the furor is ignited, there's no extinguishing it, except perhaps by force of arms. Moving on to a couple of other topics where you see similar fanaticism. The abortion argument. This is an argument that pertains more specifically to Republicans, and specifically the inner party struggle between the libertarian wing and the conservative wing, so to speak. Ron Paul holds the position that a constitutional remedy to the issue of abortion is preferable, that his stance on abortion is 100% in opposition to it in nearly all of its forms. How is he treated with regards to this viewpoint by so-called pro-life Republicans? He's treated as though he's pro-choice because he's not willing to do the one thing that they desperately want whoever they choose to represent them to do, and that is to take over the federal government and mandate that everybody in this country conform to the same abortion laws that they support, regardless to what their value systems are, and ultimately regardless of whatever extenuating circumstances are involved in the abortion. Abortion is always wrong in all cases, no matter what. To which I simply state in response, you know something? Where does that end? Now again, I'm speaking as somebody that identifies as pro-life. I think abortion is disgusting in 99% of cases, and the other 1%, it is a necessary evil in order to avoid greater evils. In my opinion, the dividing line between pro-life and pro-choice is not so much one specific line drawn at one particular point, but more so a general tendency towards favoring one over the other, and a lot of it, to an extent, is relative to circumstance. The principle is not relative, but how the principle is applied is, so to speak. The principle of, say, for example, the commandment, thou shalt not kill, naturally has different applications. Thou shalt not kill in what respect? Well, further reading into the Bible, if you're interested in that subject, would reveal that thou shalt not kill basically comes with a lot of caveats when you apply those specific 10 commandments to the broader law and the Decalogue, so to speak, of the Old Testament. And from this we come to understand that the basic commandment of thou shalt not kill does not apply specifically to those ordained cases where war has been rightly declared, where a specific ordained form of capital punishment has been carried out, and so on and so forth. Whether or not somebody supports capital punishment, in my view, is a side issue here. This is more a hypothetical argument, so to speak. I, for instance, concur with the general concept that in certain cases capital punishment is permissible and is a remedy to certain specific problems. I say that all theoretically primarily because I don't think that this particular government that we have, local, state, or federal, is qualified to carry out the specific penalty. So I don't support it in practice at present, and I would have very specific stipulations that I would need to see in action before I would support it in practice. But the theory of it, I don't necessarily have a problem with. I don't think it is necessarily the duty of society or any specific locale, as it were, to feed, clothe, and shelter every single piece of garbage that happens to come into this world and perpetuate a host of crimes against their fellow man, so to speak. I do, however, think in most cases the death penalty is not warranted, and I also think that there is a certain futility in locking people up in prison for more than 20 years, so to speak. I think by that point you're simply institutionalizing a person, and you might as well either put them out of their misery or put them into some form of basic forced labor in order to have them repay their debt to society. There's a number of different remedies to that issue. But again, this kind of gets back into my initial point, which is that fanaticism on any issue doesn't allow for hypothetical modes of thought and the idea of entertaining other points of view on a particular topic. Now, in contrast to what some may conclude from that statement, it does not necessarily follow also that a person who is open-minded will ultimately accept every single argument thrown at them as plausible. This in turn could denote another form of fanaticism, which I would refer to as the free speech fanaticism. And this is where I myself get a fair measure of grief, so to speak, because of the policy that I have moderating comments on my channel. If the same point is argued with almost the exact same language more than once, the value of the argument is pretty well diluted. You can simply say, I concur. You can say, this is why I concur. But simply go around making some stupid platitude regarding the body politic doesn't impress me. And so, by consequence, I'm not interested in hearing about it. So, in the interest of keeping a conversation on point and on the merits, I will treat certain comments as spam and delete them, even though they're not spam in the sense that other people might consider them. Specifically, some people define spam only as people who type in random self-promoting posts about this or that, most of the time completely off topic. But I would argue that adding nothing new to the topic is to an extent also off topic, and being stubborn in an irrational viewpoint, being obstinate and being unwilling to debate the issue beyond simply begging the question is a waste of time, and I don't like wasting my time because I have a finite amount of it. Didn't you get the memo? And apparently so do you as well, but you don't seem to care, at least if you're arguing from that sort of standpoint, because you're also wasting your own time. You're simply regurgitating something, you're not growing intellectually. The type of fanaticism that specifically pertains to this free speech mentality is part of a larger issue that I think to some extent is a problem for the general libertarian cause, but it's more so an issue with establishment leftism, or at least what calls itself leftism. I would argue it's fairly right-wing in the sense that it's very established. It has a very strong power base, and it's very influential, not only in politics but also in education. The fanaticism here specifically has to do with where freedom ends and responsibility begins. It also gets into the notion of radical egalitarianism, or the notion that because people ought to be the same, there ought to be corrective measures to make sure that all outcomes are the same, so to speak. There is an inherent equality in all of humanity, so it should logically follow that everybody gets the same. One of the things that a person will discover if they go through the Oxford or the Merriam-Webster dictionary, is that there is a divide in definition between fairness and equality. Fairness denotes a more, I would say, a less specific concept. It's more relative. Fairness denotes the notion that everybody gets what is needed. I would argue a step further that fairness also implies that a person is entitled to do that which he is allowed to do by virtue of good moral practices. If a person is not harming anyone else, and if he either directly or indirectly, it logically follows that they should be allowed to exercise their liberty. In contrast to this, the equality movement argues that people are not really free until they are equal, or that in order to be free they must be equal. So therefore, in the name of freeing people from being unequal, we need to start getting rid of some of these freedoms that they have that are not necessarily harming anybody else. There is an assumption that the inequality in and of itself is a form of harm. Now, this isn't borne out by basic common sense when you think about it in the most general respect. The fact that I have less money than some wealthy playboy living over in, let's say, northern Austria, who I've never met and who will never meet, how is that specifically an injury to me? How is it an injury to me that Donald Trump, somebody who I couldn't give two shits about, has more money than me? I'm too busy living my life to care about that stuff. So if I'm not cognizant of any injury, how, pray tell, am I being injured? But fanaticism dictates that regardless to all other extenuating circumstances, the fact that equality has not been established is some moral wrong that must be remedied at all costs. I argue that at all costs is the very mantra of fanaticism. And the way that I prove that I am not a fanatic and that everybody else in the libertarian wing of YouTube are not fanatics is that we're not resorting to violence to get what we want. You guys are. And thus concludes this particular ramble. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.